Hello everyone, my name is Maggie Klenke and I've been a member of the Quilts of Valor team for several years, made a few tops, done a fair amount of long arm quilting for other folks, and I do bindings for our Tennessee team that doesn't like to do handwork. So I've had a chance to be involved in the quilting process for quite a while. And I've picked up a few interesting ideas over the last few months that I didn't know before, and they've certainly made my life a lot easier, and I'd like to share them with you and see if they'll make your life easier too. So I have a couple of tools I want to show you, and I also want to share with you a tip on how to do something a little differently. To start with, let's take a look at this stick. It's called a strip stick. And look at this thing. It's really long, about the size of a yardstick. And it's flat on one side. So this side is flat. And then this other side is curved, so it's kind of a raised edge. And then the whole thing is covered in a muslin cover. Now, the purpose of this device is to press strips. So if you have strip sets, let's say you've cut with the fabric several different pieces of fabric, and you're now sewing those together in these long strips, and now it's time to press those seams. Well, it's really hard to press those seams without messing up the one next to it. The iron is wider than the strips are, and so we get ourselves into kind of a mess. And this solves that problem, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to my ironing board. I'm going to place the flat side on the board, leaving the humped side on the top. And then I'm going to take my strip and put the seam that I'm wanting to press right on top of this raised edge here. And then I can go ahead and press that edge. Now, whether I press that seam open or press it to one side doesn't make any difference. What I've done is I've raised that seam up above the other seams on either side of it, and as a result, my iron isn't going to touch those other seams. It will only touch this seam. So I can get my seam pressed really nice, and I don't mess up the others while I'm at it. So that's a pretty cool tool, and you can get these at stripstick.com. One place that you can get them. Now, I personally was doing an interesting quilt, was one of those Bonnie Hunter patterns, and if you've ever done one of hers, you know that she's all about itty bitty tiny little pieces. And as a result, there were lots and lots of very small seams and lots of seams next to each other in that process. Well, that great big long thing was just too much to be able to manage those little bitty pieces. So I decided I needed a shorter stick. Well, I could have gone to stripstick.com and bought one, but I tell you what I did. I made one. I wanted it now, and I wanted it for free, so I just made me one. So I reached into my desk drawer and I found an old wooden ruler. And I took that ruler out and I put a bit of batting on the top of it. And then I took a piece of muslin and I wrapped it around it. And then I took it to my staple gun and I stapled it down. And there you have a foot-long strip stick. And that worked out really well for me. I was able to manage those small seams and keep from messing up the other ones most of the time. And it really worked out really well. And the price was certainly right. So you can purchase these things, but you can also make them. I mean, if you've got a yardstick laying around, you can do it with a yardstick. Do whatever makes sense to you. So it can really make your pressing process just a whole lot less frustrating. So I recommend that to you. Another tool that I found was introduced to me by a teacher at a class recently is the very tiny thin pins that are, well, Clover calls them piecing pins. Other vendors call them extra fine pins, but they're very, very thin shaft. The metal part is very, very thin. And that makes it possible for you to insert that pin into your fabrics in that seam that you're trying to sew and not distort that fabric in the process because they're so thin. And the other benefit, and frankly this is the great part, is that you can leave those pins in and sew right over them. They are so tiny that the needle has almost no chance of actually hitting them. If you sew fairly slowly, as I do, then you probably won't hit them. I have on occasion, but it's been very rare. if you leave them in and sew right on that seam, then your points will stay where they're meant to be, and the connections between this piece and that piece will be exactly where you pinned it and where you wanted it to be. So I recommend that you try those out. These are extra fine pins, and they have a shaft which is 0.5 millimeters. So check that out and try to find you some of those really fine, thin pins. They will help you a whole lot. Now, I've also got a hint on how to do something that we do a lot of, and maybe do it a little easier, and certainly a little bit more accurately. We make a lot of these things, a lot of half square triangles. They're all about stars, and we're all about pinwheels, and we're doing a lot of those kinds of things in our quilts today. So we need a way to do these really easily. Now, the challenge that I see with them is that the reality of the directions to do these is that you need to add 3/8 of an inch to the measurement that you were hoping for. So let's say you were wanting to make a 4.5 inch square. That would be unfinished, and then a 4-inch square once it's in your quilt. You would make your cutting directions would say to cut it 4 7/8. So you would make a 4 7/8 white one and a 4 7/8 red one in this particular case, or the two pieces that you're putting together. Then you'd put the two pieces right sides together, draw a line from corner to corner, and then 1/4 of an inch on either side. That's where you're going to want to sew. So you sew on 1/4 of an inch on either side, and then you cut the thing down the middle and take it to your ironing board. Now, you've been cutting on the bias and sewing on the bias, and now you're going to be pressing on the bias. So there's a risk here that it won't be exactly what you'd hope for. And that's what I found, is that they tend to get a tad wonky as I went along, and it really kind of annoyed me that I was having trouble getting to have a final result that was in fact a 4.5 inch square. So what I like to do is I like to round up and say, okay, it said 4 7/8. You know what? I'm just going for 5, because I can do that easily enough. And I'll cut a 5-inch white square and a 5-inch red square, or whatever you're working with. Put them together, sew them together, press them, make it work. Now, once I've done that, I have a block which is a teeny bit larger than I want for the final result. So I'm going to have to square it up. But the benefit is that I'm going to get exactly what I want. Now, what you need to do in order to do that is you need to have one of these rulers. And this ruler, I think I can show it to you here, where you can see that line. Let's see if we can get that to come out. There we go. You can see that line down the center, corner to corner. That's your 45-degree angle. And that line, you want a ruler that has that line on it, because that's what you're going to line up on your quilt and on your quilt block. So let's take this block, for example, and what we're going to do is we're going to line it up so that we have the seam of our half square triangle right on that angle line. Now, you obviously want to put it into the corner, okay, and line it up. And then you can see that maybe it's a little bit too wide, maybe it's a little bit too long, and you want to just kind of line it up there and go ahead and cut off the excess on the top and on the side. Then you want to go ahead and turn the block around and do it again. Now, this time you want to be very careful that you have lined up the edge that's already cut on the side and the one that's already cut on the bottom. You want to line those up on your ruler on the exact measurements that you're hoping for this quilt block to be. So line it up in this case, and this one happens to be a 3.5. So, or well, maybe it is a 4.5. In any case, you want to make sure it lines up for exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And then you cut off that little edge and that little edge, and you're in business. So in the end, you've cut off probably less than 1/8 of an inch on either side. But you now have a perfect square, half square triangle, the size that you want. It's a little annoying to do all that little squaring up part, but honestly, it's well worth it, because when you have them perfectly aligned and they're exactly the right size, then you can put them together and the points come together and the pinwheel comes into the center and everything works exactly the way it's meant to without fighting with it and without any kind of challenge. So it's worth it to do it that way. So that's what I encourage. Cut them a little big, then cut them down once they're put together so that they come out exactly right. I hope that's helpful to you. It certainly has helped me, and I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions or any other thoughts that you want to share, please feel free to do that. You can share them with me at Maggie, Maggie, Klenke, Klenke, at qovf.org, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.